For the latest on our YouTube channel, click the bell icon for updates.
This is StratNews Global. I'm Amitabh, Revi, and on the talking point, we're looking at the Quad Foreign Ministerial Meeting. Our experts today, Ambassador Navdeep Suri has been India's High Commissioner to Australia. He's currently a distinguished fellow at the Observer Research Foundation and an author. Ambassador, good to see you, sir.
Pleasure.
And all the way from Sydney at an unearthly hour is Salvatore Babones. He hasn't come on our platform for a while, but welcome, Salvatore.
Pleasure to be here.
Before I get into the discussion, I just want to play out the parts of what the External Affairs Minister said at the joint press conference. So this is a question that was actually addressed to the Secretary of State Blinken and Foreign Minister Payne on Ukraine. And after they finished, this is what External Affairs Minister Jaishankar had to say.
Read on the importance of the democratic transition which was underway in Myanmar, and clearly the fact that the country has moved in a different direction is something which troubles all of us. We all, I think, also very strongly back the ASEAN position on Myanmar and their efforts to engage. But where we are concerned, India is concerned as an immediate land border neighbor. We have some very specific concerns on Myanmar, which also guides our thinking. Concerns about insurgents operating there, who some months ago, killed a very senior military officer and his family. Concerns about the COVID and the lack of vaccination on our common border. Concerns about a humanitarian situation which is arising from food shortages. So I think those are also concerns which we take into account. And where we are concerned, we don't follow a policy of national sanctions.
Well, this is actually the question on Myanmar. I'll get to the one on Ukraine. But that last sentence that sums up India's position, the Quad may be a grouping, and we call it shared vision, Ambassador, but there are differences according to each country's national interest.
Yes, we've been fairly consistent in this thing that we don't do national sanctions against individual countries just because we have an issue. We would much rather go with a UN mandated framework when it comes to imposing sanctions. But here's the important thing about minilaterals like Quad. Because they are not a formal treaty alliance, they give you that flexibility that you can agree on 80 or 90% of things that you want to do together for a common purpose. But it doesn't mean that you have to be in agreement 100% of the time on 100% of the things. It gives you that flexibility to take positions that are guided by your own national interests, particularly when it is on an issue like Myanmar. There is also an asymmetry, Amitabh, which we need to keep in mind. Of the Quad members, we are the only ones who have a land border with Myanmar. And so obviously, apart from our very well-stated position on sanctions, there is also the position that the foreign minister articulated, that there are guerrilla groups at work in Myanmar. We've already seen that post the coup last year, there was a spillover of refugees into the state of Mizoram and all of that. So when you share a large and sensitive land border, your position on that issue is going to be different from somebody who's sitting 10,000 miles away.
And it's not only that, that's not the only difference that we have a land border. We're the only country in the Quad which is not a treaty ally of the US. But Salvatore, I just wanted to get your views on the Quad. I mean, how it's evolved and where it's heading.
It is striking and instructive that we heard about Ukraine at that press conference. We heard about Myanmar. ASEAN was mentioned 10 or 12 times. About the only country in the world that wasn't mentioned was China. Now, the whole purpose of the Quad theory, or at least in concept, was to be a maritime, if not an alliance, at least a maritime grouping to counter Chinese expansionism. And yet they studiously avoided mentioning China. Antony Blinken did once, in passing, mention the South China Sea. Yoshimasa Hayashi also mentioned the South China Sea. He came the closest to actually capturing the original Quad spirit, which was a grouping of regional democracies countering China. But the other three didn't take the bait, and Hayashi spoke in Japanese.
Amitabh, if I can just comment on that on two aspects really. First is whatever Secretary Blinken couldn't say in the Quad statement, I think he's more than made up for it with the interview that he's done with Greg Sheridan at the Australian, which will say some fairly blunt things about China. But the second thing I do want to emphasize is the fact that China is not mentioned in the joint statement or in the press conference now or in the past has really not deterred the four countries from moving ahead very purposefully in aligning their positions, not just on maritime security, not just on freedom of navigation and air flights, but on substantive things like supply chain resilience, like cybersecurity and critical minerals. Absolutely. And all of that. So I just want to say that it's all right. You don't have to poke somebody in the eye unnecessarily if it serves no particular purpose to do so. So long as you're getting your job done. I mean, to sort of misappropriate a Chinese aphorism of, it doesn't matter whether the cat is black or white, so long as it catches the mice, right?
Well, the ambassador is not only correct, but unavoidably diplomatic, admirably diplomatic. That said, the Quad as the Quad, really, if it's not going to be a China, an anti-China grouping or a containing China grouping, why does it need to be the Quad? So we've heard about how the Quad's going to take on coronavirus, it's going to take on global terrorism, it's going to take on humanitarian aid, it's going to take on connectivity in the Pacific region. If it's not going to take on China, why do we need a Quad?
In each of those things, there's actually a China that you don't read about. It's there. On vaccines, for example, something as innocuous as that. If the Quad doesn't do it, then the developing countries are going to become even more dependent on China for their vaccine supplies, right? So, the intent is very much China, even though it is not explicitly stated.
So, Salvatore, just to flip the coin, in the sense, how do you see China having reacted to developments, the evolution of the Quad, AUKUS?
Oh, China still sees the Quad as being about China, and it clearly sees AUKUS as being about China. And to be clear, each of these countries is individually confronting China very aggressively in many different ways. I just think that President Biden in particular seems not to want that to be the Quad's mission. That is, President Biden has been very aggressive. He's retained almost all of Trump's confrontational policies against China. But he doesn't seem to want to use the Quad as the mechanism for doing that, versus the last administration seemed to see the Quad as its vehicle for containing China.
Right. And now let me actually play out the bite that I wanted to start off with. This is External Affairs Mr. Jaishankar, who was not directly asked this question, and it would have not necessarily gone to either him or the Japanese foreign minister. It would have gone to the next question. It was a question on Ukraine to both Secretary of State Blinken and the foreign minister of Australia. And he asked his host whether he could say something. This is what the External Affairs Minister had to say.
Observed, we are for something, not against somebody. And a lot of our discussions took off from where the Leaders Summit left off. They identified a number of areas where if the four of us cooperate practically and efficiently, I think the world would be a much better place.
Well, there you heard it. I mean, that's again one of our well-stated stands, Ambassador Suri, right?
Yeah, but again, at the risk of being repetitive, we have a special relationship with Russia. We've had it for a long time. We have a strategic partnership. Russia still is the largest supplier of defense equipment from them for us. Our new air defense systems, the S-400s, are coming from Russia. So we want to make sure that we, in this U.S.-Russia confrontation on Ukraine, we don't get caught in the middle. And we've kind of stated our position in New York by abstaining on the resolution as well. So, I think we're being fairly consistent, straightforward in our approach. And I think the fact that the joint statement makes no reference to Ukraine means that our sensitivity on this issue was probably appreciated by our Quad partners. And so while Myanmar and North Korea and terrorism make their way into the joint statement, there is no reference to Ukraine.
Right, Salvatore, in that sense, from the US point of view, is Ukraine overshadowing what the Quad is doing?
Look, I happen to live in Australia, but I am an American, and I have to say it's very difficult to explain to my fellow Americans that a strong and independent India is really what the United States needs in Asia, even if India cooperates with Russia to become strong and independent. The United States has this real focus on either with us or against us, friends and enemies. And we've seen that in this Ukraine crisis, that it has to be black and white with no gray. And that's been a real problem because the rest of the world does see shades of gray. Now, no one wants to see Russia invade Ukraine. Absolutely not. Probably not even Russians wanting to see Russia invade Ukraine. But we'd all, I think, everyone outside of Washington would like to see a more nuanced approach to this crisis that's not going to come from the U.S.
Right. I'm just going to take some questions from viewers. Ambassador Suri, if you would like to take this one. This is from Kurt Cobain. It's a pun on Kurt Cobain of Nirvana, I guess. What are your thoughts on the expansion of the Quad and how much of a challenge is the consolidation of the grouping in light of Russian and Chinese animosity towards it?
Look, as I see it, it's good to see the Quad consolidate for now. It's good to see that the very ambitious agenda that had been laid out in the March summit in Washington is being rolled out progressively. There's a focus on implementation. But I think as we go forward, we will see more and more cooperation with countries like Vietnam, with countries like Philippines. I think it will be obvious that the External Affairs Minister visited Manila, that we have done our first sale of the BrahMos anti-ship, very powerful cruise missile to the Philippines. Each one of us individually will be doing our bit to work with some of the key players in the Indo-Pacific region. I think Indonesia is a case in point. And while we all talk about ASEAN centrality and that must be respected, the fact is that different countries in the ASEAN have very particular positions on the aggressive behavior of the Chinese. Those that are being directly affected, we've seen Philippines change its stance pretty significantly in the last couple of years. We've seen Vietnam take fairly strong positions when required. So I think there is this fear of Chinese dominance, which is very much visible. So I don't say that you need to expand the Quad right now and immediately consolidate the Quad, but keep that door open for other like-minded countries. Even if they don't become full members, there's nothing to stop you from cooperating with them, and that is already unfolding, as you can see.
Salvatore, if you want to add to that on the expansion of the Quad in whatever manner, in the light of what the ambassador was saying, both BrahMos, which is going to the Philippines, we've seen now Indonesia, the Rafales, the submarines that they're getting from the French and the F-15. They're obviously not getting it for any other reason except for Chinese belligerence.
Oh, I don't think the Quad is long for this world. It may continue to limp along just because it exists, and it would be embarrassing to kill it. But I think, like the Summit for Democracy that we saw 2 months ago, I mean, who's talking about the Global Alliance of Democracies now? It was a campaign promise. It happened. It was a bit of PR. The main controversy was simply over who's invited and who's not, and then it was over. I think the Quad is going to take a little longer to die off because it is very popular. It's a great concept. It's a great idea. But I really don't think the Biden administration has any interest in orienting its Indo-Pacific policy around this grouping.
Right. Ambassador, you wanted to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I'd take a slightly different view because I think what you're seeing is two separate strands. You've got the very clear defined military or strategic perspective through AUKUS, which has given, which has teeth in a real sense. But you also have Quad, which is taking up a lot of issues that matter vis-a-vis China. And I do want to emphasize that when Quad talks about 5G, the thing that you don't see in the print is Huawei, right? And if you want to prevent a Huawei dominance of 5G across the globe, then the fact that 4 large substantial countries can collaborate on a different set of standards to challenge Huawei's dominance is a very China-centric approach. It may not have guns in it. If all of us feel threatened by Chinese cybersecurity attacks, then the need to have trusted vendors for a range of sensitive equipment is a very China-centric perspective. Again, so to me, security in today's world is not just ships and guns and planes.
Oh, absolutely.
Security is about the national economy. Security is about our data. So all of those things are of a lot of concern to the Quad. And that's why I personally think that the relevance of the Quad is growing. The fact that they've met as often as they have, the fact that they've been resuscitated. I mean, the Quad was almost dormant during Kevin Rudd's time following his statements. The fact that it's been resuscitated thanks to Chinese aggression.
Salvatore, I just wanted you to expand on what you said earlier about where you see the Quad in terms of Biden's larger U.S. Policy. You actually compared it to the Global Democracy Summit.
Yeah. The Quad is doing things to counter China, and all of the 4 Quad members are doing things to counter China. That's certainly true. But once you get away from the core idea of Indo-Pacific maritime security, I think you have to start asking, why the Quad? I mean, shouldn't the G7 take on issues around standard setting for 5G? Shouldn't other groupings be interested in coronavirus assistance? Shouldn't we be using the World Health Organization for that? I mean, there are other venues that are more appropriate for every other thing the Quad is doing. The one thing the Quad seems to be very conscientiously avoiding since the end of the Trump administration and the beginning of the Biden administration is explicit collaboration. I'm sure there's a lot going on behind the scenes, but explicit Quad-based collaboration around maritime security. The Global Summit for Democracy, well, of course, we all like democracy, but what brought those countries together? Really not much. And I think we can say the same today about the Quad.
Right. Ambassador, just going to take a second part of a question that Savan Krishnan is asking. I'm not sure about embassy in Solomon Islands. It's possibly under the jurisdiction of envoy somewhere else. But the question about maritime domain, should Quad have a headquarters in the Andamans or Chennai? That part of the question, Ambassador.
Yeah, so I think, our embassy, our high commissions in Sydney and in Fiji cover most of the Pacific Islands. So representation between the Pacific Islands is divided up between Fiji and Canberra, and there are regular visits that take place from our high commissioners to those capitals. I don't see Quad having its headquarters or something in Andamans or in Chennai, but what I do see is a very substantial strengthening of our capabilities in the Andamans. Given their strategic location, what I see is a much more effective collaboration on maritime domain awareness between the Quad countries so that we can use our respective geographical locations, whether it is Coco Islands for Australia, whether it is Andamans for India, to really keep track of the sea lanes and particularly keep track of the submarine traffic and build up the systems of communication so that we can share real-time information. I think it's a very positive sign that at the Information Fusion Center in Delhi, in Gurgaon, we now have, for example, an Australian Navy naval officer station. And I think that kind of a trust building is vital when it comes to a scenario where information has to be exchanged real time. You've tested your channels, you've tested your interoperability.
Salvatore, I just wanted you to again look at what's been happening in terms of the Russia-China partnership and how that affects other groupings.
We've been talking about a Russia-China alignment against the free world for 2 decades now. It's hot and cold and hot and cold. I don't think we need to worry much about it becoming an active partnership. I think that the worst it will ever be is a passive non-aggression agreement that they won't interfere with each other. But I really don't think Russia and China have very much in the way of common interests. They have common enemies, but they don't have common interests for a positive program to work together. And I think that's why this comes up, goes away, comes up, goes away. Even if you read carefully the Olympics statement that came out of Beijing this week, it was really very tepid. It didn't say much besides, we agree to support each other.
Ambassador, on Russia and China?
Russia's been a superpower. I don't see Russia readily agreeing to be a junior partner in the Russia-China relationship. But that probability certainly hangs over the relationship because the Chinese economy is 7 or 8 times the Russian economy at this point, or 6 times the Russian economy, and the gap is only growing. I think it won't be long before we see Russia also hedging its bets and creating alternate. Russia wouldn't want China to dominate Central Asia, which is its backyard, but China is certainly using the Belt and Road, the BRI initiative, to make very substantial inroads into Central Asia, and this is something that worries the Russians. So I think there will be enough points of tension between Russia and China, even as for now they create this facade of unity in the face of what they see as an aggressive U.S. administration or the statements coming out from the West.
Salvatore, a question from Night Library. The Quad discussed options and even presented a united front to CCCP economic coercion. Well, Australia mentioned it. How likely do you think there is a possibility that there can be a Quad comprehensive economic partnership agreement in the future?
Again, the problem is that the 4 Quad countries don't have much to tie them together economically. They don't trade much with each other compared to their trade with the rest of the world. Each of them has a China problem of its own, but each one has a different China problem. They're not the same China problems. I'm sure there's a high level of moral support that they certainly look, the Quad foreign ministers, the Quad heads of government can certainly work together much better with each other than they can with non-democratic or quasi-democratic countries like China and Russia. But ultimately, they each have their own interests, and those interests don't necessarily coincide.
Right. Ambassador, the silent bong asks, the US is supplying nuclear-powered submarines to Australia, but why do they make a noise when India buys the same high-tech weapons from Russia? Will the US, it's a rhetorical question, I guess, supply SSNs or the F-22 or the Osprey to India? Ambassador.
My equally rhetorical question to silent bong would be, is India ready to join a military alliance with the Americans? If we are, then we would have a legitimate right to expect all of the top of the line, super sensitive, super secret equipment? Do we want to be part of the Five Eyes alliance, which the Americans have? Are we ready to give up a little bit of our strategic autonomy or sovereignty or whatever else we think for what we think might be the gains that accrue from a closer embrace with the United States? I don't think so. I don't think we are ready for that at this stage. We are very comfortable in the space that we have created for ourselves of having the strategic autonomy that we enjoy, being in the position that we can say what we did today on Ukraine without having to toe the American line, or being in a position to say rebuff China or Russia or whoever, or be comfortable with the fact that we have large trading and economic relationships with so many countries that are otherwise at loggerheads with each other. So, short answer, nope. I don't see us getting those fancy toys because we are not ready for that.
Salvatore, P.S. Amzind asks. This is an interesting one. Going to Salvatore. Isn't the Quad an useless, baseless organization when the U.S. is continuously threatening India with CAATSA, exercising in India's SEZ, stopping import of fighter jets, stopping raw materials of vaccine?
No, look, it is a potentially useful grouping. I would like to see it operationalized to a much greater extent. That said, as the ambassador noted, it is not a military alliance. And I don't think it needs to be or even should be. I'd like to see the Quad operationalized to a much greater extent than it is being so right now. But that doesn't mean it has to be an alliance. It also doesn't mean that the U.S. and India have to agree on everything. As I said earlier, it may sound strange to hear an American say this, but a close India-Russia relationship is good for the United States. Now, no American leader can say that out loud because it would sound horrible on the TV news. But let's face it, if India can get the technology to shoot down Chinese airplanes, and it can get it much cheaper than from the U.S. and much more securely without Congress getting in the way, without any political pressure, well, that's much better for all of us.
If I can just, Amitabh, add to that.
Go ahead, Ambassador.
Yeah, I think the person who posed the question should appreciate that CAATSA is a U.S. domestic legislation that is not India specific. It's been exercised in Turkey's case for a variety of reasons. But when we raise these doubts about American support, I think we owe it to ourselves to be objective and also take into account the other high-tech stuff that we are getting from the Americans, the intelligence that we are getting from the Americans, the diplomatic support in various fora that we are getting from the U.S. administration, and the fact that there is now a reasonably large bipartisan consensus in the U.S. in terms of the strategic relationship with India. Even on CAATSA, I mean, I would personally be surprised to see the U.S. invoke it against India. So I would just tell my American skeptic audience.
Even if Russia goes into Ukraine again?
That'll be difficult to say. Look, legally, Biden has to invoke CAATSA sanctions against India. He has to lie not to invoke them. He has to claim to Congress that the trend of India's connection to Russia is downward, which I don't think it is. But look, what we're all struggling with here is the rise of a peer partner to the United States. We've had peer challengers, the Soviet Union, China challenging the United States. But in India, the U.S. faces a rising peer, a country that can deal with the U.S. on an equal footing, that is a partner, that's not hostile, that has no conceivable military or security stress with the United States. And I think it's something very positive for the future of global relations, even if it's uncomfortable for all of us intellectually.
Yeah, and if I can, Amitabh, if I can just add one, some 25 years back, I was posted in our embassy in Washington and tramping up and down the halls of the U.S. Congress. And you had a very famous piece of legislation called the Pressler Amendment, which was supposed to deny the sale of U.S. military equipment to Pakistan unless the President of the United States certified that the Pakistanis were not making a nuclear device. Well, the creativity of the English language, the flexibility that it offers was used to the fullest extent by successive US administrations to find ways of supplying military equipment and of certifying that Pakistan was perhaps not making a nuclear device, when everything that we know subsequently establishes that the administration. So yeah, I mean, no administration lies, but they could be economical with the truth on depending on the circumstances.
We talked earlier, Salvatore, I mean, Ambassador also mentioned about a potential expansion of the Quad, even if it's not institutionalized in different manners. Related to that is this question, again from Kurt Cobain. Could France be a significant addition to the Quad given its influence in IOR and amidst talks of France being the new Russia for India as far as the veto and UNSC and defense trade is concerned?
Well, of course, a quint involving France would be fantastic, but I think in the wake of the AUKUS submarine deal and Australia canceling the Australian submarines and French submarines in favor of either British or American ones, there's very little chance that France would be willing to join this pre-existing grouping. That said, again, I come back to this over and over again. We have to ask, what's the purpose of the Quad? And as the Quad has been recalibrated by the Biden administration, I'm not sure that that new purpose would have any place in it. Well, France could join, but then why not have everyone join?
Ambassador, last word. I mean, bilaterally, all the countries have been separately, whether it's economically, in defense, security, other partnerships have been moving forward, the Quad members, as well as France and India and Indonesia and France, they're trilaterals. Your comments on that? I mean, does it have to be a grouping, or why can't you just do it bilaterally?
Look, I think there's a certain logic that has evolved around the minilaterals that we are seeing pop up in different geographies today, and that is that a small grouping like the Quad has a much more nimbleness to respond to emerging situations. It doesn't have a permanent secretariat. There isn't an alliance document that binds you. What you have is intent. What you have is solid bilateral relationships with each other. And I think there was something very interesting that Prime Minister Scott Morrison said today after the four Quad ministers met him. He thanked them for the support that they had given to Australia at this juncture when it was facing such overt coercion from the Chinese. Let me take one case in point as an example. We know that Australian economy could be substantially impacted because of the Chinese sanctions against Australia on a range of products. Now, do Australia's friends stand up and say, we think we can support you? I mean, at a personal level, I can start drinking more Australian wine. I'm quite happy with it. But the fact is that Trade Minister Dan Tehan is in Delhi today for talks on the free trade agreement, and everything that is coming out. There are two important things. One is that India finally seems to be shedding its inhibition about free trade agreements. And the fact that the one with the UAE, the one with Australia have been put on the fast track have both an economic and a strategic rationale to it. So I think these are little ways that bilateral relationships can strengthen your friend's hands in standing up against the regional bully.
Salvatore, you want to have the final words on that?
Yes, I look forward to being able to get more Punjabi rice here in Australia. If the free trade agreement that's been under negotiation for, well, Ambassador Suri, you tell me, 10, 12, 15 years, let's hope it happens.
Personally, mangoes, my friend. How can Australia deny itself the joy of Indian mangoes?
Right. So, Salvatore, I'm not sure whether you will want to have any Punjabi rice or Indian mangoes at the moment. Now, you'll probably want a shut-eye before your next dawn. But thanks so much for joining us, Salvatore.
Thanks for the invitation.
And Ambassador, if you do have any Australian wine, I'll let you go and enjoy it too.
Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, sir. To all our viewers, thank you for joining in large numbers, asking your questions and comments. I did take some of them. Do keep coming back to our show. Send in your feedback. Like this video if you like it, and share it with your family and professional colleagues as well. I'll just put up a link. If you want to help us financially, you can help us through this link. There's a link in the YouTube descriptor as well. This is The Talking Point on StratNews Global. I'm Amitabh Revi.